if life consists of, as they say, birth, copulation and death, I think there's quite a lot of the first and last in my poetry, not a great deal of the stuff in the middle. I won't go into reasons for that. And I think I'll begin with a poem called At Birth. I was brought up in Yorkshire, but not in rural circumstances, and so I didn't see animals born. In fact, I didn't see any creature born until our second daughter, Caroline, was born in 1959, and this was the first creature I ever saw born. At Birth. Come from a distant country, bundle of flesh, of blood, demanding painful entry, expecting little good. There is no going back among those thickets where both night and day are black, and blood's the same as air. Strangely you come to meet us, stained, mottled, as if dead. You bridge the dark hiatus through which your body slid across a span of muscle, a breadth my hand can span. The gorged and brimming vessel flows over and is man. Dear daughter, as I watched you come crumpled from the womb, and sweating hands had fetched you into this world, the room opened before your coming, like water struck from rocks, and echoed with your crying, your living paradox. My father was a cashier in the Chester branch of Lloyds Bank. He'd started in Lloyds Bank when he was a boy of 17, and he'd worked his way up the ladder, and by the time I was born in 1930 he was a cashier on the counter in Chester. I can't remember anything of Chester at all. We left when I was 3 and went to Leeds, and I suppose my earliest memories really are of Leeds. Well, here's a poem dating from, well, it wasn't written in 1936, it's looking back at 1936. We were living, well, you'll see where we were living, because it's all in the poem. Most of my poems don't need a lot of explanation. The title of this poem is a date, in 1936, and there's an epigraph at the top. Sabbat Goy, a Gentile hired by Jews to carry out the Sabbath household tasks which their religion forbids them to perform. It was in Leeds in 1936, in Roman Terrace by our red brick house. I stood there with a boy who said to me, "That house just opposite, take care you don't walk near it on a Saturday. They're Jews, and they might grab you, make you cook their dinner for them." I didn't ask him why. I couldn't even boil an egg. At 6 years old, what did I know of Jews, even the word? Now, 64 years later, I remember that mystery, that warning, and remember Ariadne Rothstein, the strange name of my friend at school with frizzy hair I hugged and kissed and, so I'm told, once bit in excess of friendship. It was 1936. I'm thinking, of course, people need to be reminded of it, that this was the era, particularly, of the Nazi persecution of the Jews, the beginning of it. I'm not talking about the real Holocaust that came later, but there was tremendous persecution beginning in the mid-30s in Germany of the Jews, and leading on to the Anschluss and Austria and so on. I suppose, just looking at my poems now, there's a good deal of my autobiography over the years going on. There's another poem which seems to be quite popular in schools, I suppose, for obvious reasons, which is to do with my evacuation to America when I was just 10. I was evacuated to my aunt and uncle in America in 1940. This was just after the fall of France, and many people thought that Britain was going to be invaded by Hitler and co. Many people also thought, then they might have kept quiet about it, that we were going to be conquered. And my Aunt Nora and Uncle Frank lived in America and had done for some years, and they sent a telegram saying, "Send Anthony to us." And eventually, after a lot of negotiations and getting a visa and all the rest of it, I went. And I was taken to Liverpool docks. And this is called, it's a sonnet called Evacuation, 1940. Liverpool docks. The big ship looms above dark sheds and quays, its haughty funnels bright with paint and sunlight, as slim sailors shove about with chains and hawsers. Mummy's hand is sticky in my own, but I'm all right, beginning an adventure. So I stand on a deck piled high with prams, the staterooms shrill with mothers' mutterings and clasped babies' cries. I squirm and tug, 10 years impatient, till loud hooting signal something. The surprise of hugging her, feeling her face all wet. "Mummy, you're sweating." They were tears, not mine. She went away. I was alone and fine. Pleasure and guilt, things you do not forget. So I had 4 years in America from the ages of 10 to 14. And then when I was coming up to 14, I suddenly thought in America, gosh, I really ought to be back in my home country helping the war effort. So I wrote to my mother and father saying I thought I ought to come back. And I didn't tell Aunt Nora and Uncle Frank. I think they were a bit hurt. I think really I thought I ought to be back helping the war effort. But also a subtext, as they say nowadays, I think was that I was doing so badly at school. Terrible. My grades in my report were so bad that I'd hidden the report at the back of a drawer full of socks and things, and Aunt Nora found it. So I think I'd written, without telling them this, saying, I think I ought to come back. Anyway, I did come back. I was in D-Day. I was in the middle of Atlantic on D-Day, June 44, in an aircraft carrier, coming back unaccompanied. Well, with a lot of other boys who'd had the same idea, I think. And this is a sonnet called Maturity, 1944. A son, 14, home to father and mother, after 4 years away. The one who went a child, this one returning as a man almost, his voice broken, speaking American. He was their son, but somehow now another. The years of absence forced them to invent new habits for this foreigner. So then, the father, fooling about, faced up to the boy, put up his fists. They could behave like men in manly parody. And the son, to join in the game, put his up too, pretending they were the same, and struck. The father's nose gushed out with blood. The son watched appalled, and never understood why his father leapt and cried with joy. These next two poems, I would say, are not connected with our own marriage, but from observation. This poem is called Multiplied. He's gone with her, and she has gone with him, and 2 are left behind, and there's 4 more. The children, 2 of each, grandparents still alive and well till now, and taking sides, and neighbours, 6 close by, and more besides in 6 villages, until the whole thing multiplies by 7 score, why he went off with her, and she with him. One, left behind, has changed the locks and keys. The other keeps inside and draws the blinds. The ones who went have rented somewhere near, but no one's seen them yet. The children play with neighbours' children. Those who've gone away will haggle over them and fret in fear absence will blank them out. What clasps and binds shreds down to lawyers, judgments, mortgages. So what began in 2 especial lives, involving many more in church and bank, florist, wine merchant, dressmaker, moss bros, a regiment of relatives, a ring, has now become this other tangled thing. 2 grew to 8, with dozens at a loss to know whom they should blame, or love, or thank. So many husbands gone, so many wives. This is a rather earlier one, rather grotesque sort of image here, but there we are, called Marriages. How dumb before the poleaxe they sink down, jostled along the slaughterer's narrow way, to where he stands and smites them one by one. And now my feet tread that congealing floor, encumbered with their offal and their dung, as each is lugged away to fetch its price. Carnivorous gourmets, fanciers of flesh, the connoisseurs of butcher meat, even these must blanch a little at such rituals. The carcasses of marriages of friends, dismemberment and rending, breaking up limbs, sinews, joints, then plucking out the heart. Let no man put asunder. Hanging there on glistening hooks, husbands and wives are trussed, silent and broken and made separate by hungers never known or understood, by agencies beyond the powers they had, by actions pumping fear into my blood. On a more positive note, as they say, here is a poem written about Anne and myself. Anne is fond of this one. We got a round of applause in King's Lynn. Some of them liked it, you know. It was a good crowd that time. Together apart. Too much together or too much apart. This is one problem of the human heart. 35 years of sharing day by day. With so much shared, there is no need to say so many things. We know instinctively the common words of our proximity. Not here, you're missed. Now here, I need to get away, to make some portion separate in the day. And not belonging here, I feel content when brooding on the portion that is spent. Where everything is strange and yet is known, I sit under the trees and am alone, until there is an emptiness all round, missing your voice, the sweet habitual sound of our own language. I walk back to our room, through the great park's descending evening gloom, and find you there, after these hours apart, not having solved this question of the heart. And there's a poem called Silences, which is when Anne was away, I think in New Zealand, for quite a long stretch, and I wrote this poem for her, Silence, for Anne. This silence with you away, these silences day after day, silence itself, pure and cold and grey. Once I welcomed it, heard nothing but peace, even a bird disturbing it. Without a word, silence welcomed me, took me in friendliness, shook melancholy out, thrust a book into my hands, so that I read hungrily of what lay ahead, not thinking of the dead. Alone, silence lies along the bone, grey, cold as a stone. I think what we need is a bit of light relief. This next one is to do with simply glimpsing a headline. It's called Speaking Personally. My poor old tired eyes. I catch a headline and it says, Anthony Thwaite. My paranoia surfaces, and then I see, though dimly, the true phrase, anthrax threat. Since when the world seems safer, at least to my eyes. Perhaps one thing I ought to make clear is that it's impossible to earn one's living as a poet. And the whole of my life I have done other sorts of work. I've taught in universities in Japan and Libya. I've been editor of this, that and the other. I've done lots of reviewing and writing of other sorts. I was in the BBC several years. I was a radio producer to begin with. And all this is leading up to a poem called Mr. Cooper, which is one of my better known poems, written really quite early on, in about 1961, I suppose. And it was written soon after being in Manchester for a while, which comes into the poem, because I was up there recording over a couple of days, I think it was, the poet Norman Nicholson, the Cumbrian poet, who was doing something, reading Wordsworth, I think. And I had to stay in a Manchester hotel for 2 nights. And from that experience, there came Mr. Cooper. And this is a poem that's been in several anthologies. It's quite familiar. A lot of people think it's like Larkin. I suppose it is really. I think I was under the influence of Philip Larkin for about 10 years, from about 1955 to about 1965, and this is one of them. I think it's good of its sort. Mr. Cooper. 2 nights in Manchester. Nothing much to do. One of them I spent partly in a pub, alone, quiet, listening to people who didn't know me. So I told the bloody sub-manager what he could do with it. Mr. Payne covers this district. You'll have met before. Caught short, I looked for the necessary door and moved towards it. Could hear, outside, the rain. The usual place, with every surface smooth, to stop, I suppose, the aspirations of the man with pencil stub and dreams of youth, aged 17. And then I saw above the stall a card, a local jeweller's card, engraved with name, jeweller and watchmender for 50 years, address, telephone number. I heard the thin rain falling in the yard. The card was on a sort of shelf, just close enough to let me read this on the front. Not, I'd have said, the sort of words to engross even the keenest reader, nothing to affront the public decency of Manchester. And yet I turned it over. On the back were just 3 words in rather smudgy black soft pencil. Mr. Cooper, dead. The year grew weakly green outside in blackened trees, wet grass by statues. It was 10 to 10 in March in Manchester. Now, ill at ease and made unsure of sense and judgment when 3 words could throw me, I walked back into the bar where nothing much had happened since I'd left. A man was trying to convince another man that somehow someone knew something that someone else had somehow done. 2 women sat and drank the lagers they were drinking when I'd gone. If anyone knew I was there, or had been, or might stay, they didn't show it. Good night, I almost said. Went out to find the rain had stopped, walked back to my hotel, and felt the night, tall, black, above tall roofs. And Mr. Cooper, dead. Something that's been very important to me has been archaeology. For very many years I thought I was going to be a professional archaeologist. I mean, I began collecting things for my museum when I was about 6. And you know, my Uncle Walton, my father's brother, gave me for my 7th birthday a Roman silver coin. But you see, he gave it to me because I did collect things from a terribly early age. That's why he gave it to me. Anyway, I didn't become a professional archaeologist, but it's always fascinated me. And I'm going to read one or two poems that are to do with those aspects of my life. This is from when we lived in Libya in the mid-60s, called The Return. Eusperides is the sort of 6th, 5th century BC ancestor of present-day Benghazi, Greek colonial city, which I've been to several times. And I went with Lucy when she was a little tiny one. Lucy called it the smelly place because she couldn't pronounce Eusperides. The Return. I picked her up that hot, sand-blasted day in Eusperides, a rubbish tip where all Benghazi's refuse piled across scatterings of a millennium of mess. A broken head of earthenware, a face staring out silently, wreathed in her dress of fragile terracotta. Picked her up and brought her home and meant to let her stay. She lodged there in a cabinet and moved as we moved to this other place and lay for 20 years in England. Till today, I looked inside the cabinet, observed the spilth of dust and splinters at her neck, a fallen garment. As I gently took her head within my hands, she split and broke, her chaplet and her vestiges of dress shivering to sand. I threw her all away onto the flower bed, all of her except this one remaining scrap, her oval face lying within my palm. I have it here, this small masked relic. In this chilly year, the northern damps had killed her where she slept. The last frail remnant of Persephone, whose head it was, whom I picked up that day after so many broken centuries, miraculous and lasting testimony among the camel corpses, salt, tins, glass, and brought her home to live here. Till today she went back to the underworld as dust. Her tiny face looks up and will not last. I'll read this one. Sigma. Unable to get on with anything, throwing out papers, fiddling with piled mess, I pull a box of sherds out, stacked up here among the whole accumulation, less because I want to, but because it's there. A scattering of pottery I picked up among the Libyan middens I knew once, and rake it over, chucking out here a cup handle broken and a flaking rim. And in among it all, there's suddenly this scrap that carries a graffito, a sigma, a scratched S, and try to tell where it once fitted, as beginning or end, as some abbreviated syllable or sign of ownership, or just a scribble made on a day in 450 BC by someone else who messed about like this, unable to get on with anything, but made his mark for someone else to see. I like that.
Yeah.
My memory is that didn't take terribly long once I got the idea. And, well, his idea's not the... You know, the French poet Mallarmé said that poems aren't made with ideas, poems are made with words. Which is perfectly true. I don't find that ideas are very helpful to me. I get lots of ideas, but they don't turn into poems.
So it's finding the words.
It's
words.
the rhythm. It's the noise in the head with some words attached. That's the way a poem begins. With me, it always is. It's pretty hopeless sitting down saying I'm going to write a poem because I had this good idea. Good ideas don't turn into good poems usually until or unless there is some spark that starts it off, and the spark is, it's very difficult to describe. It is some sort of rhythm in the head or noise in the head. I say a noise in the head with a few words attached.
And would you say it's been the same thing for you all through your life? I mean, when you were writing poems, you were wanting...
In my teens, you mean?
Yeah, when you were wanting to be a poet, and then sort of...
Well, they just poured out of me in my teens, but then, you know, they were terrible. They were all just what I've been reading. They were imitations, everything. There's no harm really in that. I mean, that is how all artists, I think, begin, by imitating. They don't think they're imitating, but that's what they're doing. You've got to have, I think it's true with any art. If you're an artist, you've got to have seen a lot of pictures. If you're a musician, you've got to, a composer, you've got to have heard a lot of music. If you're a poet, you have to have read a lot of poems. It's not that you're imitating people when you're an adult, at least one hopes one isn't, but as one's learning one's trade, one's learning one's craft, one's got to read a huge amount. To see what people have done, to see what they've done well, to see what they've done badly, to see what to avoid, and all that. I'd like to read one about Alex. How to behave. Alex is almost 4 and knows ways to behave. Being silly is not one of them. He knows his grandpa shouldn't be like this. Kicking my feet up, pulling a face, putting on funny voices. This is being silly, and Alex hates it, wants to tell me so. So he takes his gran off and says to her, "Please let me talk to Grandpa by myself." He tells me what he has to say. I promise. And so I am not silly. I know how to behave, at least in front of Alex. How to behave elsewhere is something I have still to learn. I wrote a poem in 2 parts called The Art of Poetry, 2 lessons. 1. Write in short sentences, avoid unnecessary breaks, strictly control or totally eliminate the adverb, eschew such words as myriad, adopt current demotic, yet be wary of brand names and proper names limited by time. The Latinate is out, except for satire. Ease yourself into the vernacular. If you are male, try to forget the fact. If female, use the fact as document. It will allow you entry as yourself. These are beginnings. When you have begun, forget the lot and try to swim alone. 2. Travel, hot countries. Half an anecdote, the other half left to imagine things. Of these you will not speak. Strew here and there stray relatives, your people poems. In the alembic, scatter something rough, not easily digested. Let the mix come to the boil, cool off. Hint urgency, but not in too much a hurry. All these are precepts and not recipes. Whoever lays down laws lays down his head on reputation's stiff, objecting block. The aspirant asks, "Why, if these things are so, have you not done them?" And I reply, the very fact you ask will tell you why. Enigmatic stuff. My first job when Anne and I got married was teaching at Tokyo University. We got married in August 55, and then we had a lovely Sussex home counties type honeymoon. And then immediately we got on a boat. That's the way one went to these things in those days. First class, provided by the British Council. We went by boat from England to Japan. It took 6 weeks. Marvellous honeymoon. Because I've been appointed to be so-called visiting professor of English at Tokyo University at the age of 25, which is very nice. And out we sailed. And it was very happy 2 years. Worked very hard, but it was extremely enjoyable. And Emily was born. And we came back in 57. I joined the BBC, which had taken me beforehand. I mean, Mum talks endlessly about it, how the BBC and the Tokyo University appointed me at the same time, and I told BBC, look, I'm going to Tokyo, and they said, oh, we'll take you in 2 years' time, it wouldn't happen nowadays, would it? I mean, it's so awful for the young nowadays. People talk about how bleak and miserable the 1950s were. I think it was paradise. You could get a job reasonably easily, at least I found it so. Anyway, I'll read this one, which is kanji. Kanji is the Japanese name for the Chinese characters, the ideograms, which are the basis of the language. Of course, the Japanese are very complicated. They use the ideograms, but they also use two syllabaries, the hiragana and the katakana, which are ways of writing, and they also use the Roman alphabet, the Romaji, and they mix them all up together. And I was reading in the paper the other day, the Japanese are the most literate nation on earth, and you need to know 2,000 kanji to be able to read a newspaper. But, you know, kids learn these things. But there was I. This actually is later on. This is the 1980s. Kanji. As I walk, I notice the shapes of characters, bold on shop signs, on the indicators of buses, on the covers of magazines, on the doorposts of houses. Some I know and say to myself quietly. Others I recognize, understand, but can't remember what sound they make. Many I recognize but cannot understand, and many more always seem new, unknown. Ya, valley, is like a little house, but often pronounced in quite another way. I is a well, but looks like a word game's grid. Ishi is stone, a quarry block, chisel above. Kawa, or gawa, is easy, a river with banks. But 3 horizontal strokes need puzzling out. The numeral 3, but spoken sometimes as san, sometimes as mitsu, and no indication which. A rice paddy or a field is a cross in a square called da or ta, an entrance a different square, or it may be an exit. So it goes on as I walk. I am learning to read like a child, an illiterate, adding and adding, here a new shape and there a new sound, and sometimes shape, sound and sense together. But it is too late. I sit in the bus and watch a 10-year-old turning page after page of characters, reading them all, not noticing what he is doing, simply becoming someone who knows, leaving me learning alone. I do like writing poems which are in other voices. I've done a lot of that, you know, Victorian voices and voices between clouds and so on. They're dramatic monologues, really. And this is one of the earlier ones, which was... I always say that what you have to imagine about this poem, Monologue in the Valley of the Kings, is that you're to suppose that it's some hitherto undiscovered pharaoh who's lying there in his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, deep down, and he's talking to an archaeologist of the present day who is up on the surface looking for him. Monologue in the Valley of the Kings. I have hidden something in the inner chamber and sealed the lid of the sarcophagus and levered a granite boulder against the door, and the debris has covered it so perfectly that though you walk over it daily, you never suspect. Every day you sweat down that shaft, seeing on the walls the paintings that convince you I am at home, living there. But that is a blind alley, a false entrance, flanked by a room with a few bits of junk, nicely displayed, conventionally chosen. The throne is quaint but commonplace, the jewels inferior, the decorated panels not of the best period, though enough is there to satisfy curators. But the inner chamber enshrines the true essence. Do not be disappointed when I tell you you will never find it. The authentic phoenix in gold, the muslin soaked in herbs from recipes no one remembers, the intricate ornaments, and above all, the copious literatures inscribed on ivory and papyrus, the distilled wisdom of priests, physicians, poets and gods, ensuring my immortality. Though even if you found them, you would look in vain for the key, since all are in cipher, and the key is in my skull. The key is in my skull. If you found your way into this chamber, you would find this last, my skull. But first you would have to search the others, my kinsfolk neatly parcelled, 27 of them disintegrating in their various ways. A woman from whose face the spices have pushed away the delicate flaking skin. A man whose body seems dipped in clotted black tar, his head detached. A hand broken through the cerements, protesting. Mouths in rigid grins or soundless screams. A catalogue of declensions. How then do I survive? Gagged in my winding cloths, the 4 brown roses withered on my chest, leaving a purple stain. How am I different in transcending these little circumstances? Supposing that with uncustomary skill you penetrated the chamber, granite, seals, dragged out the treasure gloatingly, distinguished my 27 sorry relatives, labelled them, swept and measured everything except this one sarcophagus, leaving that until the very end. Supposing then you lifted me out carefully under the arc lamps, noting the gold fingernails, the unearthly smell of preservation. Would you not tremble at the thought of who this might be? So you would steady your hands a moment like a man taking aim and lift the mask. But this hypothesis is absurd. I have told you already you will never find it. Daily you walk about over the rubble, peer down the long shaft that leads nowhere, make your notations, add another appendix to your laborious work. When you die, decently cremated, made proper by the registrar of births and deaths, given by the Times your 6-inch obituary, I shall perhaps have a chance to talk with you. Until then, I hear your footsteps over my head as I lie and think of what I have hidden here. Perfect and safe. My mother died at a great age. She was almost 97, and I wrote a number of poems during her decline, poor thing. Here's one. Well, it was touched off by both Anne's mother and my mother being very, very old. I noticed it with myself. I'm always looking at my watch. The poem is called Watching. Old mothers, their time running out, when time doesn't matter, keep on consulting their watches, as if puzzled how time runs on, even when meals arrive on time, and each day a different carer arrives and takes over. Even then they look at their watches again and again and again. Again and again and again they look at their watches, as if puzzled how time runs on and on and on, even when meals arrive on time, and each day a different one arrives and is eaten. Still alive, old mothers, when time doesn't matter, time running out. And one that, just a little phrase, very near the end of her life, a crack of air. Would you let a crack of air in? As I tucked your small, frail body into bed that early night, a week before you died, you spoke those words I hear and recollect again and yet again. They seemed like hope renewed, as if pain might still be turned away by letting freshness in, till a new day brought light through opened windows and the sun rose in its old way. But that was habit speaking. You were old and tired and far beyond a crack of air or light or anything to hold the darkness back in bed as you lay there. And a more recent poem, it's in the last poems. Now that I'm 83, well, this was written just a year or so before that, but still. Inheritance. These little steps and quivers remind me of my mother's, yet now they are made by me, in part senility. Gestures and postures passed across the years, not lost, but as if imitated, put on and animated by limbs and flesh and features, with movements and with gestures, so that what was me becomes this parody, shuddering and moving on in jerks, till I have gone for something else to inhabit this inherited frame, the same and not the same, inhabit, inherit, give credit to the little steps and the quiver, linking me to my mother, and all that has passed, and all that is not lost. This is my father. We've still got these things. Oh, they weigh me down. All this stuff that he did for years really put me off genealogy. Ancestors. My father traced our ancestors for years through parish registers and censuses and wills, took photographs of gravestones, learned to read crabbed secretary hand, transcribe each thing from inventories, distinguishing in red the illegitimate from children born in wedlock, puzzling out the muddled names vergers misheard as year succeeded year, and the meshed generations spun like spiderwebs. My father died 31 years ago. Up in the attic, stacked in musty boxes, sit his precious notebooks, genealogies, family trees, even a coat of arms he asked a herald to construct to show that we were once armigerous. How vain in every sense. Now, in my 80th year, the whole accumulation weighs me down. I have no time now for my ancestors. This is prologue to an unfinished posthumous poem, and it's got an epigraph from Browning's Cleon. While every day my hairs fall more and more, my hand shakes and the heavy years increase. And Mum thinks I ought to make clear that this is not me speaking, it's some sort of character. I think it's got bits of me in it though. I am beginning now a late work, possibly my last, as I sit here in my pain, trying to prod the fire into action. What I have in mind, among other things, is an accurate catalogue of my contemporaries, sparing nothing as a record of these times when fatuous reputations far and wide are made by hard careerists and soft triflers. The metaphor that comes to mind is rubbish. They move it round from place to place each day, shifting the smashed, discarded, worthless waste, crumpled and dusty, bits that thrown away crumble, turn to mush, disintegrate. The basket overflows its bulging wires, distended with its crap crammed down, a task too big for 50 sweepers and their brooms. Or consider the forensic theory of interchange. It is impossible to enter or leave a situation without leaving something behind or taking something away. what will be left of these diurnal charlatans, who leave behind a trail of paper droppings like stuff gnawed by mice? They fill the journals with their whimsies, or they glower stiff with their bleak, tight-lipped, grim rectitudes. Well, I suppose I must now begin to launch into this enterprise with speed, before the reaper stretches out his blade and takes me off without another word, another metaphor, another phrase caught in my throat. The stuff lies here so thick, but I must try to clear the ground and start this record of the rubbish all around. There's a story about this one, or perhaps I'll tell it at the end.
Yeah, okay.
It's called Worm Within. A souvenir from Sicily on the shelf. A wooden doll carved out of some dark wood and crudely carved for tourists. There it stood among the other stuff. Until one night, quietly reading to myself, I heard it speak or creak. A thin, persistent scratch, like the first scrape of a reluctant match, or unarticulated word that made me look for it within myself as if I talked to myself. But there it was, scratching and ticking, an erratic clock without a face, something as lifeless as rock, until its own announcement that it shared our life with us. A woodworm deep inside, drilled with its soft mouth through the pitch-stained wood, and like the owl presaging death of good, its beak closing as the dynasty died, it held fear in those infinitesimal jaws. So, to be practical, we must choose two ways. Either to have some expert treat the thing, trivial, absurd, embarrassing, or throw it out before the infection eats the doors and floors away. This Trojan horse in miniature could bring the whole house down, I think to myself wildly, or a whole town. Why do we do nothing then, but let its course run ticking, ticking through our nights and days? You know what really happened? It was published in the Observer, that poem. And then a little while later, a letter was forwarded from the Observer, from Rentokil, saying, can we do something to help you? Their poetry does make something happen, you see.